This is Dying Your Way.
Welcome back to the Dying Your Way podcast. I'm Claire O'Berry, and this is another one of the episodes that I just found very provoking in the 5 years that I've been doing podcasting. And this was 2020, and my first interview with Stephen Jenkinson. Most people in my audience know who Stephen Jenkinson is. He wrote the book Die Wise. He's worked in palliative care for years, and he's quite the cultural activist, and he's very thought-provoking. And just from the very beginning of this interview, we really talk about the state of humanity and where we are culturally with how we treat each other, and certainly how inept we are when it comes to death and dying. And so this is part of an ongoing conversation that I love to have, and I think you'll really enjoy this conversation with Stephen Jenkinson.
Hello, I am so happy to welcome our guest today, Stephen Jenkinson. I have spent quite a few days binging on so many videos and podcasts and interviews, and I am honored to have you as a guest on the Dying Your Way podcast. Just for those that don't know who Stephen Jenkinson is, he's a Harvard graduate with a master's degree in theology. He has a master's degree in sociology from the University of Toronto. He has been in charge of a counseling team with palliative care for years. He is also a poet. He is also an author. He is a musician. He's a cultural activist. And he is
farmer.
And a farmer. Can't forget, you're a farmer in Canada. And
my spare time.
And Canadian by birth. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to begin the interview by, after seeing the body of your work, it really made me remember an incident I had with my granddaughter, who's 22 now, but she was 13 at the time. We were in Santa Monica, and I think I was taking to a soccer game, and needed to get gas, pulled into a convenience store. And as I'm filling the gas tank, I noticed there is a man who is like completely still, prone position underneath a bus bench. And I watched him and waited to see if he was breathing, if he was okay. Mm-hmm. I went into the convenience store and I told the man that, he probably should call 911, that there was a man that could be dead for all I know, and he needed to check it out. And he said, "Oh, he's just a drunk. He's always there. He's fine." So I got back in the car, and my granddaughter and I just watched all these people pass him by and ignore him, did nothing. And I said to her, if it was a dog, everybody in Santa Monica would be going to that dog. They would be checking for a collar. They'd put it in their car. They'd take it to their vet. They'd see if there was a chip. They would find it a home. It would be a rescue dog. I mean, they would go to the ends of the earth if it was a dog. And it's a human being and nobody's doing anything. What is that all about?
It's because he's a failure. See, the dog's not a failure. The dog gets a pass, right? Because the only reason the dog would be laying under a bench is if something went horribly awry that the dog couldn't do anything about or compensate for. When a human being's underneath a bench in a city somewhere, I'm not agreeing with this characterization, by the way, but I'm giving voice to it. When there's a human being under the bench, he or she must have done something to get themselves there or failed to do something to keep themselves from being there. In other words, there's a bizarre and unspoken, but very obvious moral code at work over and above the unwillingness to get involved, you know, in the standard urban dilemmas. But I think that's the big one, that the dog didn't do anything wrong and the person laying under the bench inert must have.
Yeah. Yeah, I've just thought about that for so many times, but I was particularly thinking about it when I guess it was looking at your new book about elderhood, how discardable older people are, and certainly vulnerable older people are. And we certainly see that now, you know, during the COVID-19. I mean, I see so many comments on Facebook about, you know, well, they're older, they're going to die anyway. And it infuriates me. It really does. Yeah.
Well, the accusation that people are going to die anyway applies to everyone. So it's a rather bizarre criteria to use.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say that about a 3-year-old. I've often said something in the order of, if we were honest with ourselves and with each other, which is a huge and insurmountable if, but if we were, at some point in the first meeting, when you're invited over to see the new child, the baby, the newborn, you look over in the bassinet and you look down, make the proper cooing sounds and so on, and then look up at the eager, keen, and vaguely exhausted new parents and say, not bad for a dying kid. See, and, you know, it sounds macabre, obviously, but this is par for the course if you believe, as so many undigested Buddhism practitioners seem to believe, as well as others, that, quote, we're all dying all the time. I mean, I hear this malarkey constantly. It's demonstrably not true, but more importantly, why do so many people cling to the notion that we're all dying anyway? Apparently, there's some relief in that, because when the real dying finally comes along, apparently it's no big deal, because it's just another day at the office for the old walking wounded, you know. And that's why I say, if you really believe that we're dying all the time, then you should be leaning in to the very, very young and admiring their nerve, given the fact that they're dying too. Of course, they're not dying, most of them. And it's ludicrous to make such an allegation, you know, and regardless of what kind of soothing or ease it introduces into the circumstance, it's false and it doesn't belong. And it deeply unnerves us when the real dying comes on, because it bears no resemblance to another day at the proverbial existential office. Well,
the majority of people don't lean into death, and we're so culturally conditioned to ignore it, and it's going to happen to other people, but for some reason we don't think that it's going to happen to us. And there's a huge amount of fear around death and dying. I mean, I know you've seen hundreds and be on the bedside of hundreds of people that have died, and have seen deaths that have not been great, but surely you've seen deaths that were what you would call a good death. And what's the difference in that?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be so sure that I've done so, and here's why. I always understood my job as being one in which I was to work myself into a position where I'd become obsolete to the people I was working with. Just unnecessary. That's, you know, when they outgrow me and my present.
Who is this? Who is
the dying people and their families.
Okay.
When they have no need for me, there's a good chance that I've done something right. That's the cue that I would take. So by definition then, when things are going well, reasonably well, or better than reasonably well, I wasn't there. You see, I know these things happened because I was gently relieved of my duties, so to speak, you know, and glad to be relieved, I should say.
Yeah.
But I would say easily 90%, 95% of all the deaths that I attended were by any sane measure insane and deeply lamented. And I still, from time to time, I still lament over the avoidable but unavoided bad dying that I was attending routinely. So what's the difference, your question is, between, let's call it a dying that you'd want to be in on and one that you'd like to be spared? Okay. Well, it seems to me that all the bad dying that I saw, and it was a lot, had a couple of cardinal features in common that were more or less unmistakable. And when I describe them to you, they're not going to sound too bad. But I have no reason to lie to you or to exaggerate or to leave things out. So for what it's worth, they were almost uniformly personal and personalized.
Meaning?
I'll tell you, they were the individual dying person's prized possession to dispose of as they saw fit. Their dying mysteriously belonged to them in a way that nothing else in their lives belonged to them. But this was the order of the day. All the bad deaths were kind of inward turned, and you could say self-absorbed and self-referential. And it was family and close friends only. And the wagons were circled. And the possession part was a very big part of things. The reason that I'm pointing these dilemmas out to you as constituting a disaster is because of what they banished. And what they banished was what we have instead of a culture trying to find its way in spite of itself towards some kind of cultural capacity. And when people die that way, they're removing from the culture one of the culture's principal ways by which it learns itself and practices sort of a broad-based understanding of what its responsibilities are to its citizens and to the world that sustains it. And that might sound like an awful lot to lay on an individual death, but if we flip it and ask on the few deaths that I attended that were remarkable and even enviable, you could guess that each one of them overturns those criteria I just mentioned. So each remarkable death was outward looking, and it was not held as a possession. There was no proprietary exercise. There was instead the notion that mysteriously, one way or another, everybody belonged. And the dying in turn belonged to everyone. The meaning of the dying belonged to everyone. The consequences, especially the longer term consequences, all belonged to the living, not to the dying. And the dying person was, as marrying people are, the occasion for the very best of what people were capable of personally, but also especially culturally, to come forward. And more often than not, it did. And I should say, as a PS, one of the wonderful things about the good dying is that the medical practitioners, God bless them, I should say, but the medical practitioners were basically turned to for what amounted to care and feeding, if you will, a kind of custodial pain and symptom management orientation, and nothing further was required from them.
Right.
Because the whole person reality of dying was attended to not by other professionals, because somehow miraculously the death wisdom that was available had been democratized across the family, across the range of friends and caregivers, across the casual neighbors and so on. And that democratization has the consequence of enabling people and daring them to show up for active duty, whether they're invited to or whether they're not.
There are a lot of people that I've seen that have had a really good death, and I call it a good death just because they had planned, they were surrounded by loved ones. It was expected. It was, they had appropriate palliative care at the level that they wanted. It was empowered. And the ones that weren't, and I've seen some, where they're begging you to basically pull their plugs for them. It's so bad.
Yeah.
It was unanticipated. It was unplanned. It was the family members unwilling to let them go and were willing to let their loved one suffer just so they would stay there, for culturally how we've been indoctrinated to keep people alive at any cost. And I listen to what you say, and it sounds poetic, and it sounds kind of grim at the same time too, and I'm just, I want to do what I can to support people to prepare to have the death they want, whatever that is.
A lot of people imagine that this is the optimal outcome, but one of the things worth considering when you make that your goal is where the whatever they want comes from. And generally speaking, the kind of death that people envision for themselves tends not to come from a lot of experience with the dying of other people. It tends to come from a sense of dread about a deeply avoided kind of death. That's one. Two, if the key to a good death is being in control, being in charge, and getting what you want, I humbly submit to you, you're asking for it. Because there's not much in dying that obeys your shopping list.
Okay, I hear that. Yeah. But the fear that people, the anticipatory fear that I think most people have, are there ways to mitigate that?
Well, first of all, it's not like the fear doesn't belong. It's not like it doesn't fit. It completely and utterly fits. So the notion that it shouldn't be there and it's the indicator of a bad death is one of the things that makes bad death. You see, I would say instead, fear has a right to be there. I mean, Jesus, you should be full of dread from time to time at the prospect of dying. And here's why. I was asked routinely, I still am from time to time in interviews, but much more often years ago, whether or not I found that dying patients who had some kind of spiritual or religious practice or affiliation had a better time of it than people who did not. And of course, they normally expected that the answer would be yes. And my routine answer was no. And they were dumbfounded. How could this possibly be? And this is how I explained it to them. You see, most people's religious or spiritual practice or orientation, when it comes to dying, is not derived from the realities of dying. That religious practice or orientation is derived to contend with the realities of dying. And in that sense, it's not informed by them. It's not there to aid and abet the realities of dying. It's there to thwart them or reduce them or diminish them or make them tolerable, etc., and so on, you see? So lo and behold, you're back to the same adversarial stance regarding the dying that's obviously and truly and properly yours. And with that in mind, a little bit of a grammar lesson.
Okay.
It goes like this. So we have the verb to die in the English language. We've been using it a few times here. If you think about how people use it and you think about the grammar, you'll be, I suggest, maybe deeply surprised to hear. If you try to use the verb to die in the passive voice in a normal sentence, in normal English, you will discover after 3 or 4 futile attempts that you're having a very hard time doing so.
Mm.
And why is that? Because you don't know the English language too well? Well, some people don't, but that's not why. You could know the English language top to bottom and still not be able to do it. Why not? Because in the English language, the verb to die is by definition exclusively an active voice verb. Translation, dying is what you do. It's not what happens to you.
Got it.
And it's built right into our grammar, you see?
Yeah.
So my way of saying that would be that if dying is something that you do grammatically, then it's something that you do existentially and morally and ethically and spiritually and so on. In other words, there is work to undertake.
Right.
And the failure to undertake it,
Mm-hmm.
or the resistance to do so, or the ignorance around this idea, all of these things have consequence that no one intends for themselves or for somebody that they care about. But it's no less consequential if you fail to undertake the work of dying, which should not begin with the terminal diagnosis.
But what is the work?
Well, among other things, it's what I've been saying since we began, right? One of the principal aspects of the work of dying in the West,
Mm-hmm.
I should say, because it's different in different places. But in the West, if we don't begin with a fairly faithful understanding of the poverties that we bring to dying, the tremendous dark and disastrous learning around dying, around limits, around frailty, around futility, all of these things, they will come whether we invite them or not, you see? And when they do, and they come to us unawares, the consequences are enough to write a book about, which I did. So you could say that the notion of work at all comes to this. Work is the thing that you're least inclined to do. That's what makes it work. So your work would be different than mine because your least inclinations wouldn't trouble me and vice versa, right? But enough of us gathered in one place, we begin to realize that we might share certain disinclinations because of the nature of the culture that we come from. And one of them is the inability to give dying its due and to show it the proper respect.
I agree.
And the proper hospitality when it's in the neighborhood, and then when it's in the house, and then when it's in the room.
Yes.
You know, as things go on. So I've said, and I've persuaded by it, that dying is a god. The dying is a deity. It's not like a deity. It's not symbolizing a deity, but it's actually a deity. And if that's true, then the principal question to those of us who are attending dying people and to dying people themselves is, what is your responsibility to dying now that it has come to call, now that it has not mistaken anyone else's house for yours or anyone's time for yours? Now that the news that you were waiting for, is this what dying's like? Yes, it is. Am I dying? Which, I mean, as you've probably experienced as well, it is an extraordinary thing for a fellow human being to look at you, open-faced, moon-faced, and say in all earnestness, am I dying? Like that. And to know that your principal responsibility to a fellow human being in a moment like that is to make sure they do not get out of that conversation still not knowing what the answer is.
Right.
No matter whether they welcome the answer or they don't, or their families thank you for whatever you say or they don't. The truth of the matter is a fellow human being needs affirmation at a time of deep confusion.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's part of the work.
I love the in the Grief Walker film, and you're talking to a young woman who's dying, and just your factuality, but kindness, and just it was just a wonderful conversation that you had with her.
Mm.
And I'm sure that was your role, but most people don't have someone like you with them when they're dying.
Yeah.
So
Well, a lot of people would think that's a good idea, I should say.
No. So what's the alternative to that? I mean, doctors aren't having these kind of conversations with their patients.
Well, I don't know that I could agree. The only reason is that it's an enormous statement to characterize all doctors as,
No.
see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I mean, I certainly was aware that there were doctors who were trying to, but I was assistant professor in a medical school, so I was familiar with their curriculum in a general sort of way. Yeah. And I can tell you in those days, physicians had absolutely no training, no sensitization when it came to the organ of their body that they most heavily employ in delivering end-of-life care service. And what organ is that? And some people say the heart. No. Some people say the mind. No. And finally, I put them out of their misery and I say the tongue.
Yeah.
The tongue. In other words, you will talk your work. Be you a physician or a respirologist, be you a GP, be you a nurse, etc., and so on, a social worker and all of that. And with minus the training, the assumption is that you'll just know how to talk the talk when the time comes. And I was there long enough and deeply enough to testify without hesitation that that's not true. Without a high degree of sensitization and real orientation to the dilemmas at hand, the chances are just as good that you rely upon half a dozen stock phrases, and an unexamined orientation to dying, which turns you into customer satisfaction specialist and turns a dying person into a customer. And you end up just, quote, giving the people what they want.
I know what you're saying. But so now with the coronavirus, I mean, here we have a situation where people that aren't used to being around people that are dying in the emergency room or in ICU, or, I mean, generally, they don't experience that as often as they are, and certainly without family members there. So what have you heard on the lines about how people are coping or not coping with that?
This is just a guess on my part, which, any answer has to be given what's going on and how isolated we tend to be. But I would guess that somewhere within a year to 18 months after the all clear whistle blows, whether they find a vaccine, whatever the all clear looks like, which is increasingly murky. But when it happens, I think you'll begin to see a degree of undiagnosed, straight up trauma reactivity beyond any particular exposure to this particular virus or any other virus or any other undoing, that the consequences that are now making their way through the culture that have to do with more or less in total withdrawal of the voluntary aspect of your social behavior, right? Where it's being more and more prescribed. And don't get me wrong, I'm not objecting to that. I mean, in this country, in my country, there's not a problem with being told how to behave by people that you elect to, to cover for you in times like this. There are other places, and the States is obviously one of them, where it's an enormous and extremely divisive and probably implacable dilemma. And it's not a situation that I envy or I can't imagine trying to live through it. But for all of that, what I'm pointing to is, the rate of death from this disease is remarkably small, given what the fears were initially, and probably will remain so by the looks of things. So the trauma I'm describing doesn't come from suddenly, legions of people exposed to grim, asphyxiating death by virtue of this thing. That's not what's going to happen. What's happening instead is it's already underway. That the notion that this could, through a combination of inattention on your part and uncaringness on somebody else's part, result in an extraordinary kind of death for you or for someone close to you. The fear that will almost certainly never come to pass has its own consequence in the present moment. So I suspect that the dominant culture in North America is going to be in unspeakable moral and spiritual distress in 2021, for sure.
Yeah. You were also talking about the jump, the leap from just really invading wilderness as it relates to the coronavirus. Speak a little bit about that, because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. Well, there's people are not spending a lot of time right now trying to figure out where it came from. Obviously, it's been isolated to a particular place in China. Beyond that, people have been willing to let go the initial theories, and you don't hear much about them now. But if you remember back in March and April, one of the things that was being talked about is a particular market in that city in China. And in this market, they sell a lot of live animals or barely dead animals. And many of them we would call bush meat or wild meat, right? And these are sold cheek by jowl with domestic protein sources, let's say. And it would appear from everything I read at the time, being no expert, I'm just cobbling things together like everybody. But it would appear to me that the virus was a consequence of bringing the wild and the domesticated into a kind of proximity, which is in itself unnatural. And that unnaturalness somehow bred the jump. They were too close. In other words, by definition, the wild is supposed to be on the other side of the threshold. It's supposed to be out there for its sake and for our sake, see? Yeah. And when you draw too close to the wild, sometimes there's consequences for the wild, demonstrable, species collapse consequences. And sometimes there's consequences for the humans. And this is our turn, it would appear.
Yeah. Yeah. Globally, it seems like there will be more of the same, because we continue to go into the wilderness in places where we really need to leave it alone.
Don't belong.
I think we will see more of that. I believe that you've said, or I've read in Die Wise, that we have a moral obligation to die well. Could you just explain what you mean by moral obligation to die well and what that looks like?
Sure. These are good questions, by the way. My compliments. I'll tell you a story, which doesn't seem to be about dying at first, but I think you'll see the parallel. So I was teaching in an alternative high school, which is a bizarre concept by itself. Yeah. An alternative high school. Well, kids in high school are already rebellious in the extreme. So an alternative high school would be what? No rebellion? Well, who knows what it is. But anyway, there I was. And the question part of the evening's entertainment opened up. And the very first person who asked me a question was a gothed up 17-year-old girl, right? With razor blades and the bangs and the white pancake makeup and the whole thing. And she was vaguely terrifying to me in my 40s. So I can only guess what the consequences were to, boys of her own age trying to strike up a conversation.
Right.
She put up her fist to signal that she wanted to ask a question. Not like this. Her fist was closed. And when I acknowledged her, she said, "I have a right to kill myself." That's what she said, right out of nowhere. And clearly, she was saying it not really to begin a discussion, but to end a discussion, you see.
Mm.
And this is not an unpopular view.
Right.
She has the right to kill herself. In one of its extremes, it's euthanasia or doctor-assisted death, right? So, of course, everybody, all the staff in the place went bananas because you're not supposed to talk about suicide around kids, not in any official capacity. But fortunately, I was an employee and I didn't get the memo. And so I was kind of ready. And so this is what I said to her. I said, have you got anybody in this world who loves you? And she just looked at me, like, it's none of your business or worse. And I said, I'm not asking for names. I'm just asking if you do have anybody in this world who loves you or you suspect loves you. And she finally, out of exasperation, said, yes, like that. I said, okay, fine. Next question is, do you have anybody in this world that you love? Because it's not often the same list. It's probably a different list. Not asking for names, just do you? And she said that she did. I said, okay, you don't think I'm responding to what you said, but I am. I heard you. So here's my response. If you act on this right of yours and you are successful, as they say in the business, that means that you are compelling or obliging at least one or two of the people that I just asked you about to either find you in that condition or identify you in a morgue. That's what you mean, right? By your right to kill yourself. That's what you meant. And, to her credit, she went blank because that's not what she meant. She didn't even think of that.
Right.
And this is the problem with a language of rights unexamined when it comes to what we're talking about now. Because the truth of the matter is that dying people exercising their right to die when and how they see fit is one thing. But the consequences of them exercising those rights, they don't live with even one of them for any length of time at all. All of the consequences they leave behind, as far as we know, they leave behind so that the living have to muddle their way through the kind of existential snakes and ladders of an arrangement like that.
It's a real ripple effect. Yeah.
It's a tsunami effect more often than not,
Right.
but it's so quiet and it's so subtle. So if you take, for example, the dilemmas about euthanasia, one of the things you'll see if you have an open mind about it is that when people decide to have their life taken from them because they've had enough, which I don't say is an easy decision to make, but when they decide that, what is the message or the learning that comes to the living around them? Thank God that it's there so that it's my turn. I don't have to go through it either. I think the subtler message by far is, listen, man, dying is a horror show. You better hope that they legalize euthanasia where you live before it's your turn. That's the message. That's the learning about dying that ensues from it, you see? So far from soothing people's suffering when it comes to dying, I think it augments the suffering unawares. I'm not saying anybody intends for this to be true, but I am saying it's an observable consequence. In my country, the entire country has legalized physician-assisted death.
Right.
I would suggest to you that within a generation where kids who are being born right now will not have a memory of a time when this was not true. You investigate the death phobia that prevails in the culture then, a generation later, and see whether or not euthanasia has eased the fears and the terrors around dying by assuring people that they don't have to suffer. I'll bet anything I have that it'll be worse then than it is now.
I need you to repeat just that last part because I didn't get what you were saying, why it would be worse. If it's a universal thing that people are allowed to make that choice, you think it would be worse for who?
for everyone. Here's why. So, and this is not hypothetical because in my country, we've gone through it. Right?
Okay.
So there's all the contentious period where people for and people against were going at each other horribly and saying horrible things and making accusations about, dog's life and obliging people to suffer, and on it went. Or legalized murder, just on and on and on. Not very authentic discussion, just a lot of stance and position taking and all that sort of thing. The truth of the matter is that the culture that was investigating the possibility of this legalization was itself a death-phobic culture. Now, if you don't believe that, nothing I can say. But I suggest to you very strongly that was true. So now, see, just follow this. There's two little links, and I think it'll become quite clear.
Okay.
So a death-phobic culture is a death-phobic culture after all the measures that it takes to try to have an easier go of it. You see? So when a death-phobic culture legalizes euthanasia, doing so instead of challenging its death phobia.
Right.
Instead of doing the existential work of trying to figure out how this death phobia came about in the first place.
Right.
We simply have another solution to something that we're not willing to learn about. The consequence then is you have solutions, but they don't touch the problem they were designed to solve. So in the next generation, you have a solution that's somehow floating called freedom of choice that doesn't touch the dread around dying, that actually enforces it and reinforces it, because it whispers, you better hope that you have this choice, because dying is hell.
Okay. So I don't know that I agree with it, dying is hell, personally. And that's just...
I don't agree with it either.
I don't think it is. Yeah.
Of course not.
Good. I agree. Okay, so how do we take control or responsibility for our own end-of-life scenario? How do we let others know how we want to die?
Well, I mean, there's mechanisms already in place for this very thing. I'm sure where you are, just like where I am, whether you want to call it, excuse me a second, advanced directives or living wills or things of that kind. The technology, if you will, is already there. And of course, you could just tell people until you can't talk anymore. You can do all that. But one of the things that misses when you take personal preference and you enthrone it and you call that the boss, you never wonder where the preference comes from or what kind of subtle and inadvertent confession it's making. So I'm going to suggest to you the likelihood is this, and it's a big generalization, and it's just something we're talking about. I can't prove it, but I don't need to prove it. I was there. And if nobody believes me, it doesn't trouble me at all. But here it is. When people establish, let's use a good example, a really handy example, so-called dignity, right? And what are the markers of dignity? And I can tell you by far and away, the most significant marker of dignity, the point at which life was not worth living anymore, was when you couldn't be in the bathroom by yourself. Okay? In other words, the value of your life comes down to who wipes who.
Right.
Okay? Now, I'm not saying it's easy. Okay? Yeah. It's not supposed to be easy. But the point I'm making is, do you really believe that the value of your life comes down to not be able to be in the bathroom by yourself? This is what it's all come down to? Your entire life comes to that? So, I mean, it's a bit of an extreme example, but it's a very common one. So you take the idea and you apply it to anything that's in the advanced directive, and you ask yourself, why is that the breaking point? Why is that thing that you're identifying now the place beyond which you have no desire to go? This is not to challenge someone, it's to invite them to think about it really for the first time this way.
Mhm.
Rather than seeing to it that they get what they want, you investigate where what they want
Mhm.
comes from. And much more often than not, it comes from a sequence of fears and dreads, you see? And dread and fear is not the most useful way to mobilize how you should die.
So when I was binge watching Stephen Jenkinson yesterday and a few days before, I was binge watching and I didn't even get through it all. But I really asked myself that question: what would be my ass wiping moment, for lack of a better word? And it's when I can't learn or grow anymore. You know, because I think you can even be learning and growing at the very final stages of your last breath. There's something to learn there for me. And I think I do want a natural death, and I want to be as little of a burden to the people that love me as possible. But when I don't want to learn and grow anymore, I'm ready to just wrap it up, you know?
Man, what if you're depressed instead of terminal? What then?
Well, even
because you've just described depression very well, no?
I don't suffer depression, so I don't know what that feels like, but yeah, but I'm just inquisitive. I'm curious. That's what I love about my life. And if that was not there anymore, it's, you know, what use would I be to anybody?
Yeah, these are understandable and important questions, but I guess my response to you would be to say, how did it come to pass that you being useful to other people is the final benchmark of whether you should be here or not? I mean, there are periods of time during the course of your healthy years when you're basically no use to nobody. Come on now, you know that's true. It's true for me. It's, you know, there's periods of tremendous self-absorption, isn't there? Or tremendous despair, or tremendous distraction, or horrific bouts of consuming, and whatever it is. And during those times, of course, are you really useful to anyone? And the answer is, of course you're not. But this is not the criteria by which we should determine whether or not Claire should stay here with us, or whether she should be gone now because, you know, she's too self-absorbed because she's binge watching Netflix or something.
Okay, well, what's your moment?
I guess it's a moment that I'm not likely to be that lucid by the time it arrives, and it would be something like this: the override that's applied to my capacity to die by the technology and or the drug regime, the override that obliges me to continue, despite what would seem to be my own body's capacity to say enough already. That would be indefensible to me. Now, here's the thing. You can be in that moment and nobody's quite aware that you've entered into that moment. So you have to catch up to it after the fact. So this is not designed, what I'm saying is not designed to make sure it doesn't happen, but rather to make sure that it doesn't continue once somebody has come to their senses and said, but he was dying before this. Now he's not quite dying, but he will. Somebody needs to talk about the merit of obliging him to linger in this halfway place. Something like that would be, to my mind, indefensible and shouldn't be allowed to continue. But like I said, would I be there going, hey, wait a second? Well, you know, given how severe things would be by that time, the chances are not that good that I'd be lucid or responsive even.
Yeah. My dad had a lot of things going on with him, but he was, had all of his oars in the water till the very end. And my mother had Alzheimer's and was physically very healthy, but, wasn't there. And I often wondered, thinking of the pain that my father went through and the loss of beingness that my mother went through, which would be worse. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know what their experience was, but it was interesting to observe the difference, for them.
Sure. Well, beyond a certain point, you're not doing much.
Mm-hmm.
You're on the receiving end of the marching orders of your chassis, right? And if you've practiced before that moment, you know how to, let's say, you have a sense of how to go along with it, is the simplest way I would put it. Now, this is guesswork from everything I watched and saw. I haven't exactly been there. I've been pretty close. And I have some memories of it, but this is me sort of imagining and remembering at the same time that, your body, I think, has its wisdom. And if it's not too interfered with, it can do the math. It knows how to die. And the amazing thing is, if you were to ask people, it's a bit of a crazy question, where do you die first? Could you point to a place, or what do you think? Generally speaking, it would be to the primary site of the cancer, typically, or something very close to that, whatever seems to be breaking down most obviously. Mm-hmm. But of course, the body is a whole event. It's an entire weather system, right? So what's happening in the spleen has consequences for the endocrine system, which have consequences for the respiration, and on and on and on. Mm. So the much more accurate answer is that your toenail is dying at the same rate as your kidney, which is dying at the same rate as your eyebrows, which is dying at the same rate as your capacity to be terrified about dying. And there's some real genuine reassurance in there once you let go of the idea that you're supposed to be in charge of this thing.
Have you had a near-death experience?
Oh, yeah.
I have too. I think that's why I'm not afraid of dying. Uh-huh. Because of that. One of the things that you talked about was how, I'm so many words, that there were opportunities that would come from the new normal that will be with us after this pandemic is over. And one of the things that you talked about was the smallpox blanket. And I love that analogy. I love that story. Would you close this interview by sharing the story about the smallpox blanket?
Okay. It's not a happy ending story by any stretch, but sure, you've asked and I'm happy to do it. Well, everybody probably who's listening is familiar with the reference to smallpox blanket. This was part of government policy, official and otherwise, to solve the so-called Indian problem starting in around the 1840s or so in your country and maybe a generation later in mine. And to a great degree, it was temporarily successful. The way they did it, of course, is that they infected blankets with the spores. Not that everybody quite understood the science, but they knew enough to know what infection was. And then they traded these blankets to principally tribes on the Western Plains, and they would die in relatively short order. So the parallel to this virus today is obvious. I mean, it's about as virulent, and we have as much defense against COVID-19 as the Native Americans had against smallpox, for example. Mm-hmm. So the point I was making when I made the observation is this. We are in a position now that we didn't choose, that the worst of the disaster that we anticipated a few months ago appears not to be coming to pass. We were, until fairly recently, in a situation of relative stillness, or I mean, they use the word lockdown, but anyway, we were forced to stop our momentum.
Mm.
And when your momentum is interrupted, most of you will complain and bitch and gripe about it, or worse, take up arms and so on. But there's a small part of you that experiences the disruption of your momentum as something almost merciful. Why? Because you get a chance to wonder about the momentum that you never get when you're in its grip. See?
Mm.
So it seems to me that mysteriously there could be a tremendous upside to the measures that most government bodies have tried to make the populations take to, care for itself. And the upside could be that we decide not to reconstitute the life that we were living before the onset of this disease. That is my deepest hope for this situation. And I believe it's a futile hope. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the evidence is already quite clear that given half an opportunity to go back to the beach and all the other stuff, that people will do it without even hesitating, without even thinking about it, as if it's their right to live the life that got us into that situation in the first place. So I say that with great regret and more than a little grief, to be honest. And I don't know what young people who are not alive right now, but are born in the next 20 years, I don't know what they're going to think about what happened in 2020 and 2021, what it's going to mean to them, or what we're going to mean to them when we had a remarkable opportunity to proceed radically differently, and we didn't.
But we may. We may.
Yeah, I don't think so. So it comes to this. The Icelandic government, about a couple of months ago, I saw this piece of news. There was a glacier in heavy retreat because of climate change, right? Mm-hmm. So they put a plaque at the foot of this receding glacier. And I think the plaque was addressed to the future. And I believe, as I remember it, this is what it said. We know now what's happening. We also know what we should be doing. Only you will know if we did it.
Mm.
You could put that plaque at the foot of COVID-19 and it would say and it would mean exactly the same thing.
Well, maybe if enough millennials hear this interview, mm-hmm. There are people that have the power to change the policy and to take the lessons that are available to us from this and not take back that smallpox blanket. They just don't have to. I hope so. That's Amen. My hope. Yeah. I'm going to end the interview, and while I'm doing it, I want to introduce some of the music that you do with Gregory Hoskins. You have a, well, I guess you're not doing it now, but Nights of Grief and Mystery Tour. That is a great combination of music and poetry and soul searching that I know the audiences love. I hope you get a chance to get on the road soon with that now. And
what do I could tell you, I'm going to meet with him tomorrow, and we're going to work in the recording studio for the next 4 days to put the finishing touches on a new record that partly came from the last tour and has 4 new pieces that I've written since February.
That's wonderful. I can't wait to hear it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this interview. I can't tell you what an honor it is to meet you. And I know the Dying Your Way podcast listeners will really take a lot from this interview and look a little deeper into their own souls. And what we all contribute to this planet just by being here and dying here. Dying here is a contribution too.
That you are.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you for the invitation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you for joining us on Dying Your Way. If it's inspired you, then please spread the word. Leave a rating and review so others can find out about us. To learn more, connect with us on Facebook or our website at dyingyourway.com. A special thank you for the artist Mel Dobra for letting us use her song, Smoke and Flame, as the soundtrack of our show. I invite you to return, hear each episode, and be part of the conversation on death literacy. I am Claire O'Berry, and this is Dying Your Way.
Reaching